This is part of the autumn series, which is broadly sort of grouped around ideas of using secondary data sources to answer social work or social care related questions. And we've been really lucky to get Morag and Sam to come along this afternoon. They can introduce themselves and explain what they're going to be talking about this afternoon. In terms of practicalities, the session is being recorded. So I would ask that during the session, if you can keep your mics muted, please. Obviously, because it is being recorded, if you don't want to appear on screen, feel free to knock your camera off. There'll be lots of opportunities to ask questions both during the session and afterwards. And again, Morag will explain how that works. So I'll hand straight over to Morag.
Okay, thanks everyone, and thanks for the invitation to come back to Cardiff, even though it's a virtual coming back, but I'm very happy to be here and hopefully you'll find the session useful. We're going to talk about the British cohort studies. Most of them are birth cohorts, but not all of them, and I'll go into a bit of detail about that in a minute. And really how we think they could be valuable for the area of social work, social care, and people in care or care leavers, as well as carers. So we've got a sort of kind of, I'm going to give you an overview of the variables that are available and the ways that you might use this data or this resource in your own research. So I am Morag Henderson. I'm a researcher and currently acting principal investigator of Next Steps, which is one of the studies that I'm going to introduce you to today. My work more generally is mainly focused on educational inequality, but I'm also interested in mental health, well-being, and currently have a project looking at social isolation. As I've sort of alluded to, I did my postdoc at Cardiff, so it was my first job after my PhD, and I have a real affection for the place and respect for the work that's done there by colleagues, some people here, and that work particularly at Cascade. So really looking forward to spending some time with you today, albeit virtually. I'll introduce my colleague, Sam Parsons. Dr. Sam Parsons is a senior researcher at CLS. Much of her research experience is involved working with the top two older cohorts that we hold at Centre for Longitudinal Studies, the NCDS and BCS studies. And again, I'll go into some detail about those in just a minute. Her research interests include antecedents and consequences of adult basic skills, excuse me, social exclusion and socioeconomic disadvantage. And the reason that I've sort of chivied Sam along to come along today was really to give you some examples, some case studies of work that's done in the area of social care, but using the British cohort study. So here's just a quick outline for today's session. I'm going to give you an overview of the data sets. Some of you may already be familiar with some of them, but many of you, I imagine, will be new to them or haven't heard much about them beyond sort of the names. So I'm going to go into a bit of detail about that. Discussing some relevant variables for the field that we're interested in, how to access the data, and then I'm going to hand over to Sam, who's going to present some work in progress on a recently funded Nuffield Foundation grant that I'll let her talk you through. And then I'm going to present some work that I did with Jonathan Scourfield, who's here today, also from a long time ago now, 2015. But I'm going to show you some of the results from some early work on that. Again, just to sort of showcase what can be done with this type of data, and hopefully also get you to think a little bit critically. So Martin had asked me to consider some of the pros and cons of secondary data analysis, and in particular quantitative approaches. So we're going to have a bit of a discussion about that, and then there'll be time for questions at the very end. But I should say throughout each of the sections, so the first three, I'm going to talk through the first three bullet points, and then there'll be time for substantive questions. Sam's going to present her research, and then there'll be time for questions. And then similarly, once I've presented my research, there'll be time for questions. So there'll be lots of opportunities. If it's a clarification question, Sam, I think, will interrupt me when I'm talking and ask it. So if you please use the chat function for that, so that if it's going to help your understanding of what's being said, please do interrupt and ask a question via the chat. If it's a more substantive question, I just say, please wait till this sort of section at the end of each subsection, so we can have a bit more of a discussion around it. So the aim of today is really to introduce you to the longitudinal data sets, show you some of the variables, demonstrate the power of these resources, looking at 2 case studies, and then discussing pros and cons. Does that all seem sensible? I think if I can't actually see you because I'm sharing the screen, but I can hear you. So please shout if there's any issues or questions. So, okay, let's have a look at the data set. So at the Centre for Longitudinal Study, CLS, it's an ESRC funded resource, and in it we house 4 national longitudinal studies. Essentially what these are is they're distinct from cross-sectional studies where we might just ask a bunch of people what their well-being is on any given day, and then the following year we might ask a different bunch of people what their well-being is the following day, and we would sort of consider that cross-sectional work, which is useful for capturing a moment in time, but not necessarily for answering questions that might be interested in change over the life course over time. So these longitudinal studies follow individuals, usually from birth, mainly from birth, and we follow them across the course of their life. And at every sweep where we interview them, we ask them a series of questions on almost every domain you can imagine: health, well-being, diet, relationships, family, fertility, most things. And I'll talk through about that in a bit more detail in a minute. At CLS, we provide free data to the research community, and it's all housed at the UK Data Archive. And we also provide documentation, guidance and training, and we ask researchers regularly to sort of shape and consult with us to input on the data we collect. So there's a very strong voice for, let's say, polyamory or complex romantic relationships for the next week, then we would include that for some of our cohorts. So we listen to the research community about what is the sort of main priorities going forwards. We also at CLS conduct research. We've got quite a large multidisciplinary team that's both substantive and methodological, so including surveys, statistical metadata and all of that. So as well as sort of managing this resource in these cohort studies, we also produce research from them. So here's just a sort of overview of the study timelines in the future. So the youngest cohort that we currently have is the Millennium Cohort Study. They're currently in early adulthood, just about turning 21, 22. So they were born at the turn of the century. And so I don't know if you can see my pointer, maybe not. But the first dot on the red line denotes that we measured their characteristics at birth, so age 0. So that meant we went to their parents, got information about pregnancy, about whether mother smoked, what their parental education is, birth weight, etc. So a number of characteristics at birth. And then we followed them throughout the course of their lives. So every time you see a dot on that line, it's a data collection. So it's a sort of quirk of the cohort studies that they're not all spaced evenly. And there's lots of good reasons for that, mainly funding, in truth. But for MCS, we went to speak to them at age 0, 3, 5, 7, 11, 14, 17, and the most recent one is 22. Next Steps is quite different. These guys were born in 1989-90. It wasn't a birth cohort study. Instead, it was an adolescent study. It was originally set up by the Department for Education, and they were followed throughout their schooling. So these dots clustered together show that they were measured age 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and then there was a break in the study and then remeasured at age 25. There is a little dot on the arrow there, so we're going back into the field for age 32. The other two cohorts, British Cohort Study or 1970 study, they were born, as the name suggests, in 1970 and have been followed through their life course. I forget how old they are. They're just turning age 51, I should do the mental maths, and the NCDS, which is the oldest study that we have, were born in 1958. BCS 78, NCDS and MCS all have a slightly more biomedical or health focus, whereas Next Steps had a much more educational focus. And that's changing as we're sort of developing the studies to be much more biomedical. So currently then we're in the field, actually with all of the studies, which is unbelievably unique. It's partly because COVID delayed the interviews. So a Millennium Cohort Study is about to go into the field for age 22, next steps about to go into the field for age 32, BCS and NCDS are in the field at age 62. So if you can just picture for the NCDS, they were born in 1958. We have, how many sweeps is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 sweeps. So the wealth of information across 12 sweeps on any one individual across the life course is there. And that's sort of, if you could sort of multiply that by 4 and then think about how much information that is. So the other thing that we have, and I'll come back to, is that obviously the COVID pandemic has created sort of quite a unique social situation. And we're interested in whether or not inequalities have widened or reduced in any particular ways and for any particular groups. So in 2020, we went out into the field and asked participants, our current participants, to take part in a web survey. So we also have these specialist COVID sweeps, and some of the content there might be useful for thinking about your own research. So I'll come back to that in just a second. The typical information covered, things like from birth, household composition, obstetric history, smoking and pregnancy, labour, birth weight, length of the baby or the cohort member. And then we follow them up through their school years, through primary schooling and secondary schooling, capturing information on their housing circumstances, financial circumstances, family dissolution or sort of unification, cognitive tests for many of them, educational attainment, and then we follow them sort of through university if they go to, but from that transition from schooling to adulthood and labour market sort of employment. So in adulthood, we've got information on health, housing, basic skills, cognitive tests, well-being, mental health, income, social class, employment, all sorts of things. And I'll say a little bit more about how you might want to use the sort of typical information covered in the way that you might use these studies in your own research in a little while. So as I said, in addition to the 4 main studies and the multiple sweeps within the 4 main studies, we have this COVID-19 data. Oh, sorry. We have this COVID-19 data. Oh no, I was on the right slide. Sorry, it's a bit confusing on my screen. This is where we had 3 sweeps in May 2020, September 2020, and February 2021, where we went to our cohort members and asked them to complete a web survey on basically how they were faring during the pandemic. It included things like whether they were furloughed, what their family circumstances were, whether there was conflict, more conflict within the home than normal, homeschooling experiences. For the MCS who would have been at university at the time, we asked them about their break in education. So there's lots of information on the same sample that we have in the main studies for the COVID data. We also have 3 new cohorts. Now, maybe this is a bit too much information at this stage, so I'll just sort of whiz through them. So in addition to the 4, we've got those born in the year 2000, those born in 1989-90, those born in 1970 and 1958. We've got 3 new cohorts coming that we're involved in. One is just a feasibility study that we're just trying to establish, as the name suggests, whether it's feasible to introduce a whole new UK-wide birth cohort study. If it's judged successful, a new larger study will be commissioned in 2024. And so that's something that's on the way. Children of the 2020s is already commissioned. It's a new birth cohort study that's being run in conjunction with CLS and the Department for Education and other multiple partners, I should say. The list is quite long. But it will go into the field or start at least recruiting in early 2022, and they've commissioned 5 waves of the longitudinal study. So you could sort of start to see that if you invest the time in developing your skills in these secondary data sources, these cohort studies, there is like a huge wealth of information and resource that really could sustain your research career throughout the whole of your life. You might never need to use any other data sources. I'm not suggesting that that should be the case, but I'm just saying. So that one's just about to go into recruitment in 2022 and will be a sort of longer term project. And the 3rd new one that we're involved in is one that came out as a result of obviously the COVID pandemic, and the question of how are those in school faring as a result of having just much less contact time with teachers and home learning. So this is a study called Cosmo. I keep calling it Cosmos, I get in trouble, but Cosmo, that's CLS and other teams within UCL. And it's going to be 12,000 young people who will be followed throughout their education and longer term career outcomes. So again, it's another cohort type study. This one's not birth cohort, but it's an adolescence cohort study. And we'll look to see how they fare longer term compared to other students. So that's the sort of overview. The sort of takeaway to re-emphasize is really this. This is our sort of main bread and butter, currently available. You can download them today. MCS, Next Steps, BCS 17, NCTS. It allows for some cross-cohort comparisons based on similar ages, and it allows for looking at change in individuals over time. So I'll just move on to other relevant secondary data sources. So this isn't just a sales pitch. You might disagree with me. It's not just a sales pitch for centre or longitudinal studies. We also want to highlight some of the other relevant sources for the field of social care, social works, caring, etc. So these are still available on the UK Data Archive or UKDS, and I'll explain how to access them in just a second. But just to make you aware, there's the British Household Panel Survey, which takes a similar sort of longitudinal design, but is slightly more complex in that it follows households. So if Sam and I lived together and I was the main, so if I was married to a partner and I got divorced and moved, the cohort would still follow me. And then if I moved into Sam's house, it would also follow Sam over the course of the life. So it becomes quite a complex household panel survey, but captures very similar information to the sort of the ones I mentioned that we have in the cohort studies themselves. The most recent version of that is now called Understanding Society. So the sample was beginning to dwindle in the BHPS, and so the UK HLS was a sort of update of the sample, and so it becomes again a sort of longitudinal but household panel survey. And they have information on social care, caring, etc. And I'll show you some examples in just a second. ELSA, as the name suggests, is a longitudinal study of aging, so it focuses on the older age group. So if you've got a particular interest in social care among the elderly or aging groups, then it might be something you would want to look at. There are regional variation in longitudinal studies. Growing up in Scotland is one. Maybe you want to compare the policy differences or the outcomes of particular policies in Scotland compared to in Wales. And as a descriptive, you might want to look at how well-being is different between Scotland and Wales, for example. So that might be a place that you do that, or at least start with a baseline. And the other one is an update to Next Steps. Actually, it's called the Longitudinal Study of Young People in England too. And so it follows a similar cohort, but again, there's questions on social service contact, police contact, caring responsibility, etc. And I'll show you these in just a second. So these, just to be aware of, there's such a wealth in resources of these secondary longitudinal data sets. So moving on to the overview of sort of relevant variables, I'm going to show you a list of variables, and then I'm going to tell you how I found them so that you can replicate it. I should say this isn't an exhaustive list. I also don't want to make it exhausting, but I sort of want to show you what is there and what sort of technical issues you might come across when you start to look at some of these variables. So here I've got a list of the variable or the question, or at least the information that would appear in each data set. On this slide, I've got NCDS and BCS. And so when you see the numbers in those columns, it just means that the question, have you ever been in the care of the voluntary sector, is asked at age 11 in NCDS and age 33 in NCDS. That exact question is not asked in BCS, but the information can be gleaned from some of the other questions. And then on the next slide, which I'll show you again in just a second, has got next steps and NCS, the younger cohorts. So I've just put the sort of similar in age cohorts next to each other. So the types of information, again, not exhaustive, and I can show you how to harvest this yourself. So the first was whether or not they've been in care by age 11 or age 33. BCS has the child, so the parent is being asked, has the child by age 10 ever been in care? And if so, why? And what age were they last in care? So we're starting to get close to reasons, duration, or timing, maybe not duration in fairness, but timing. Similarly, a slightly different question, but similar sort of sense of it in NCDS was asked at age 7 and 16. We've got a number of separate occasions in care at age 10 for BCS. Were you ever, to your knowledge, in care as a child? Longest period in care. So, you can sort of get a sense of the kinds of things. BCS, age when first in care, years, months, etc., number of separate occasions, the longest period in care. So you can start to see that you can build a picture across the whole of the life course about people's experiences of being in care. The younger cohorts have these similar questions about care, being in sort of voluntary care or legal care, but they also have included other things like number of hours of caring responsibility and who they take care of. As well as sort of contact with social services or educational welfare officers. With all of the cohort studies, we have usually a household grid. So within that, you can identify whether the cohort member was fostered, adopted, whether they have both biological parents in the household or one biological parent and one step parent. So you can sort of track that over time, and that's consistent across all of the cohorts. So you can start to see the types of information that is available in the cohort studies. And I just sort of want to flick back. So if you sort of picture that information and then picture that information in conjunction with the sort of typical information that's covered in the cohort studies, the key thing is that these types of variables here can become your dependent variable or your outcome variable. So you might start thinking about how has being in care at age X or for X number of years or for X reason, how is it associated with cognitive test results or educational attainment or health? It could be like, what is the association between duration in care and health at age 25 or at age 30? And so you can start to see how these typical bits of information can become your sort of research question or your dependent variable or outcome variable. The other variables where it's useful is that they can act as a sort of control variable. So let's say we're interested in the health of care leavers. We might also need to take into account education, because we know that education is both associated with being a care leaver and health. So we're trying to best isolate that relationship between care leaver and health. So all of the other variables can act as sort of mediators, control variables, so that to sort of isolate the effect of one variable on the other. So think of the whole resource as a way to sort of approach a research question, not just the variables that are there that ask about social care or care leavers or caregiving. You can think about it in the context of all of the other bits of information available. And those can either become, as I say, the dependent variable or the control variable to better isolate the relationship. I hope that makes sense. In terms of the other studies, so the COVID-19 suites, we've got questions on whether they needed help caring for yourself. Now, obviously, in the context of the COVID pandemic, that might have a slightly different meaning. It might be sort of physical health or virus related. But you could sort of think about it in terms of, sort of social network or social support, and whether they received help, whether they needed help caring for others in the household, and whether they received that. So there's a number of questions within the COVID suites, which covers all of the cohorts, and they're completely harmonized. So it includes the Millennium Cohort, Next Steps, the British Cohort Study, NCDS, and the 1946, which is a cohort that's in UCL, but not within the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, but increasingly we're beginning to harmonise our research questions alongside theirs. So looking at the COVID suites, you can do a 5 cross-cohort analysis on these types of questions in relation to another variable that's also measured. For example, mental health or well-being. Understanding Society, which is one of the studies I mentioned that's held at the UKDS, they have a lot of questions on caring responsibilities, and they're asked regularly, annually, I think it is. How many people do you care for? Who's the first person you look after or help? Who's the second person? So then you've got the relationship, it's not just how many, but the relationship between the cohort member and the person that they're caring for. Whether or not caring prevents employment, and how many hours per week worth of caring that they do. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the types of questions. I'm going to pause in a minute to take any questions that you've got for clarification. But that is a sort of idea of what's there. In order to harvest this, what I did was I went to a search tool that the ESRC also funds called Closer Discovery. And you'll see I've taken a screen grab from it. On the left-hand side, I've just selected the variables that I want to be searched for, or the question wording. And within the search bar, I just typed in care, caring, carer, in care, various iterations of that. And what you see is that the results come up with the study name, NCDS in this case, at age 33, so that was a 1991 sweep, and it was in the medical interview section. So what that means is you could go to that data set, download it, knowing it's in there, and check to see what the proportions are who have ever been in care, and decide whether that's a big enough power for you to run your analyses. I actually think Closer Discovery has that functionality where you can just see the quick distribution live on the site, but maybe not for all variables. But that's quite a useful starting point. There are some alternatives to Closer Discovery. You could download the questionnaires, which are available either on the UK data service, and I'll give you more information about that in a minute, or the Centre for Longitudinal Study website, which is available on that link, and I'll make these slides available also. You can just open up a PDF of the actual questionnaire and type the words in that way that you want to find, or download the actual data sets and look at the variables. So there's multiple ways. Some may be easier for some of the more sort of SPSS or data savvy people than others. So just to make that clear. Okay, I've mentioned this a few times then, how to access the data and how to access help. It's basically another ESRC funded resource. It's like a data archive where people who are often funded by the ESRC are expected to deposit their data there so that it encourages replicability. We're expected to provide our data as a resource and also some supporting materials. And it's a single point of access for a whole range of secondary resources. There's lots of webinars, there's support guidance and training on their own website at the UKDS. The data comes in a number of different formats. I've mentioned that there's lots of documentation around it also, but the SPSS data tab delimited text, which I think is a bit more compatible for Excel. So it is easy to download. And if it's non-secure data, you can literally download it in minutes. If it's more secure data, by which I mean potentially disclosive, there's a slightly more advanced registration process required. But accessing the data is just through registration, and the information's on this slide. And again, I won't talk through it, but I'll make these slides available to you for accessing it outside the session. So I'm going to pause. I realize I've done a lot of talking, probably much more than I expected actually, but let's stop and see if people have any questions. Any questions or clarifications on the resource, the variables? The coverage, there's a question in chat, what's the coverage like for these studies in Wales? Everyone has Welsh people except for the Next Step study and the English study specifically. So the Millennium Cohort Study, actually Chris Taylor from Cardiff has been a real sort of advocate for Wales to make sure that the sample size is big enough for power. I actually don't know the proportions off the top of my head, but it's definitely analytically valuable. Similar for the BCS, the British Cohort Study, and NCDS. I think, oh yeah, Sam's answered it. Older studies are based all on babies born in 1 week, so 4 to 5% would have been born in Wales. MCS has a different design, but has a boost numbers for living in Wales because of Chris Taylor. Thanks, Sam. Sorry, I hadn't spotted that. But yeah, there's some other data sources there. So yeah, does anybody have any other questions about the actual cohort studies, or shall we move on to Sam's case study approach? Okay, Sam, are you happy to come live and share your screen and talk us through some examples of some work in progress? Thank you very much. And thanks for answering those questions. Sorry.
No worries.
I hadn't scrolled down.
You're forgiven. So thanks, Morag, and hi to everybody. So I'm going to talk about the project I'm currently involved in, which is looking into care leavers and children of care leavers. And this study will actually be one of the first to examine the experiences of care leavers who became parents and the intergenerational impact it has on their children's adjustment. And for this research, I'm going to be using the 1970 cohort and also the Millennium Cohort as we go through. It's a 2-year project, which I started in March of this year. So the main motivation for this research is due to the persistent evidence on the increased risk for psychosocial adjustment problems in later life amongst children who have been in out-of-home care. However, even though there is evidence for that, it should always be remembered that although the evidence suggests adverse outcomes for care leavers in adulthood, there are, of course, many individuals who beat the odds and who develop into well-adjusted adults. There is, however, hardly any knowledge about the experience of children of care leavers, so the extent of the intergenerational transmission of the trauma, as it's often referred to in the literature, associated with out-of-home care. And what is known suggests that children of care leavers are at a greater risk of coming to the attention of child protection authorities and of being taken into care themselves. So one of the key aims of this project as we go forward is that we want to identify the potential protective factors that can enable positive adjustment. So just to recap on the questions that I'm exploiting here. So back in, in BCS 70, back in 1975, the mother was asked about any time that she had spent away from her parents as a child. And at the same time point, so back in 1975, she was asked about whether the child had been in any of the following situations, so foster parents' home, assessment centre, children's home, etc. And then, as Morag has outlined, there were further questions when the cohort member was age 10 and at age 16. And then the cohort member themselves was retrospectively asked about whether they had spent any time in care when they were 30. For the Millennium Cohort, the parents have been asked, most of the early sweeps, about whether they had spent time away from both of their parents before age 17, and if yes, where did they mainly live during this time? I have not made use of the follow-on questions to do with the length of time or age of first, because I didn't have such comparable data for the 70 cohort. So in terms of prevalence, in BCS 70, 3% of cohort members had a care experienced mother, so 382. More, 562 had experienced care themselves, with a very small minority of just 48 had a mother who had been in care and had also been in care themselves. In terms of the Millennium Cohort, we have 2.4% of cohort members with a care experienced parent. And in this study, we also know whether it was the mother or the father who had been in care. And so this is something we want to utilise as the project goes forward to see whether there's maybe a differential impact on child outcomes as to whether it was the mother or the father who has been in care. So this research, although it only started this year, was funded by the Nuffield Foundation a long time before the outbreak of the pandemic. And so these were our 3 key research questions that we are aiming to answer. So what are the social and economic resources available to parents who have had care experience as children? To what extent does parental care experience impact on their children's development? And we're going to look across a range of developmental milestones from time of birth through to 16, 17 years. And we'll end up looking at education, participation, and attainment. And then we're going to focus in on just the care experience families and looking at what are the factors and processes that promote positive development among their children. However, as Morag's outlined, we did have a pandemic and we have had surveys throughout that time. And so this has given me an opportunity to look at how care experience is associated with health and well-being during a pandemic. And the focus is on BCS 70, who themselves turned 50 in April 2020. And the study members have been interviewed 3 times during the pandemics, firstly in May, then September, and finally in Feb 21. And I'm looking here, because of data availability at the time when I started, we're looking at outcomes that were in September 2020. And I'll be able to compare the experience of children of care leavers, those who have experienced care themselves, and against the majority who families and people who have got no experience of care at all. So I'm going to start off with a few descriptives. So this here looks at some health and mental health outcomes in September 2020 by care experience. And so the darker bars are if the cohort member themselves has been in care, middle colour if their mother was in care, and then the lightest bars are those with no care experience at all. So what we can see is that for the cohort members who themselves have been in care, they're far more likely to report poor general health and poor mental health, and also to experience symptoms associated with depression and anxiety. We can also see that the rates were higher amongst those whose mother had been in care, but they are much closer to the general population rates, or more specifically, those with no care experience. Okay, some further outcomes. We looked at levels of social contact, loneliness, and feelings of control, and whether you have someone to listen to you. And I think here we can see that that any experience of care is associated with lower levels of social contact, and often or sometimes feeling lonely. But in terms of feeling control over what happens in your life, or not having anybody to speak to, the association here is with direct experience of care. So before turning to some multiple regression results, I'm just wanting to outline some of the key sort of family backgrounds, socio-demographic differences by care experience, which we're going to include in the modelling. And this chart shows that for the cohort members who've been in care themselves, they were more likely to be female, to have had low birth weights, to have been born to a single mother, and for their mother to have only had minimum levels of education. In terms of, for those whose mother had been in care but not themselves, it's only the lower levels of education that the mother experienced, which differentiates themselves from the main group of people with no care experience in their families. So in terms of own attained adult status, so this is taken from the COVID survey. So here we can see that if the cohort member had been in care themselves, they're far more likely to be living alone at age 50, more likely to have only got no or low level qualifications, and less likely to be to have attained a degree. Although at 14%, it's still 1 in 7 have managed to get a degree. And they were also more likely to have experienced stable unemployment and less likely to have experienced stable employment during the pandemic. So that is, we asked them what their employment status was just prior to the pandemic, and then at this point in September 2020. So, and again, for the cohort members whose mother had been in care, the main real difference is that they had also experienced less stable employment during the pandemic, and this was due to more having lost their job. So 11% had lost their job between March and September, compared to just 4% of those who experienced who had no care experience. Okay, so moving on to the multivariate logistic regressions. So these will show us how the associations between care experience and the adult health and well-being outcomes we've looked at are attenuated when the differences in background characteristics and current circumstances are also taken into account. And I'm going to present odds ratios on the graph, And an odds ratio, essentially, if it's greater than 1 when confidence intervals don't cross the line at 1, which will become clear in a second, it means that there is a significant association with care experience and the outcome of interest. So looking first here at the general health and mental health outcomes. And here we can see that for the cohort member who has been in care, the association of their time in care with poor general health, poor mental health, and symptoms of depression remains significant, even when we've taken into account their background characteristics and current circumstances, although the association with higher levels of anxiety is removed. And then we can also see that for those whose mother has been in care, there is no significant association with any of those 4 outcomes because the confidence intervals all cross the line at 1. Okay, moving on to the social contact and loneliness outcomes. Again, starting with the cohort member who's been in care. Here we see that low levels of social contact and not feeling in control of how your life is remain significantly associated with their care experience, but feelings of often feeling lonely or not having someone to talk to, again, the significant association disappears. And turning finally to those whose mother has been in care, again, none of the associations remain significant, although if we look at low social contact and often feeling lonely, so that's the blue and the red dots at the top, the confidence will only just touch the 1. So there is a suggestion that these are more experienced by these cohort members, although it is true that it's not statistically significant. Okay, so just a few concluding remarks. The association, the findings add to the growing body of evidence of the long shadow of care experience, which continues into the 5th decade of life amongst those with direct experience of care when they were children. Importantly, however, we show that this shadow does not necessarily affect all, and in particular, it doesn't affect the children of care leavers. Many are as well adjusted as the next person, and we've shown that the intergenerational transmission of disadvantage is not as omnipresent as is sometimes perceived. And so going forward, our future analysis will aim to highlight the key protective factors and processes that support effective functioning amongst parents and children and their children.
Amazing, well done, Sam. Thank you. So this is a time to sort of shake the body and rattle the brains and think about some questions if you have them.
There's something in the chat.
For Sam, oh yes. Great research with strong policy and practical relevance. I agree, Jonathan.
Oh,
yeah,
great.
I think it's really powerful. And I think the thing to emphasize, and maybe it's not so strongly emphasized in your last slide yet, is that it's the pandemic experience. So whether or not that persists outside the pandemic will be sort of interesting. You know, some of the conclusions perhaps maybe need to be contained within the pandemic bounds.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But open to questions. People can either wave, start talking, raise their electronic hands, wave their real hands, but questions.
Shall I stop sharing?
Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah, Jonathan, can you comment? Yes, please do.
Yeah, thanks both. I was really interested in that, Sam, and I wonder, am I taking it too far if I say that your findings about maternal care history are a challenge to routine children's services practice, where, you know, there is evidence that a mother having been brought up in care is seen as a risk factor?
Yeah, and that's for which, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, so, you know, I think the fact that you're finding on the whole that group does not have outcomes that are significantly different from the general population or the non-care population, it is quite a wake-up call, perhaps, for practitioners.
Yeah, I think so, because that's as I was saying, you get this, I don't know whether it's in the general press or whatever, you have a feeling that if you've been in care, it translates down the generations and there's these troublesome families, etc. But actually, of course, we only ever know about the children who end up in care, whether they've got a care, history. You don't know about, if you like, the success stories. So this is what we're trying to shed light on, is that because it's only the care. If your mum has been in care, I think you are at a higher risk of experiencing care compared to families that haven't experienced care. But there were so many people who don't go into care, but you would never know about that, because obviously those mothers in this instance would never be followed up, or you would lose track of them once they've left the care system.
I think Jonathan's, or part of Jonathan's point, is that it's not just a public perception. That Louise Roberts' work, one of our colleagues, really highlights that social workers often see a young person either in care or has left care, being pregnant or having a child, as a risk factor, and they're far more likely to have children taken into care than other young people. And that so this offers, I think, a really useful challenge to that perception. I think therefore there are policy and practice, well, it may not implications, but challenges to conventional practice that come from this. I guess that's what you're sort of thinking about, Jonathan, is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with Jonathan. I think it's really, really, really interesting. I guess there's a couple of things. I don't know if these are questions, but they're just thoughts. One is that both the nature of care and particularly the nature of leaving care, which is when a lot of, if you like, I think the harm is done, have changed very substantially. So kind of the good thing about being able to go back and do a long-term follow-up is well, you get long-term follow-up, but the difficulty is care is a bit of a movable feast, and the nature of it changes, and therefore the characteristics of people coming into it and maybe what's offered is changing over time. So a lot of the, in the 1970s, much higher use of residential care, and when you were 16, you were chucked out, or 18 at the most. I'm not saying it's a million times better now, but it is far more likely to be foster care. And there is at least an attempt to offer support going into adult life.
Absolutely, with the sort of up to age 25. And so that is a challenge of this stage, in that we know that being able to compare the Millennium and the 70 cohort, that they are very different experiences. And so we will be focusing more on originally it was just going to be the Millennium Cohort. But in terms of what the BCS 70 data we were able to do, is because that's actually an interesting question that I have for people, is that in the BCS cohort, the mother, well, it was generally the mother, was always asked, has your child been in care? Whereas those questions are not really included in the Millennium cohort. So the numbers I have are, like, if they're in a foster care situation, but the numbers are very, very small. Mm. And I think, and so when the last time they were interviewed, when they were 17, this was the first time that the child was the key focus of it, and the question was put to them, have they ever been in care? And so going forward, that will be repeated. And so although it's retrospective, you will be able to do some comparisons, sort of more of children themselves who've been in care and whose mother has been in care, and what outcomes there are. But it's not, the numbers aren't there yet in the Millennium Cohort to be able to do that. So that's why I focus on BCS, although I know that it's talking a very different care experience as what's going on today. But the fact that you have all these disadvantages into your 50s is, well,
absolutely, really important stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry, I had some domestic distractions at the beginning, so it's possible that this was kind of addressed. But you were talking about the differences between the groups sort of at the end point. And did you look at some of the changes over time? Because I wondered over the life course how some of these things vary.
Yeah, no, that will be something. So what said, so sorry if you missed it, was that this was funded before the pandemic, and we are going to look at all the milestones through childhood and adolescence and everything up to whenever. But because we suddenly had the COVID data, and to make it, if you like, more policy relevant, we looked at the COVID data first, and we just looked at the age 50 outcomes. But that's where we're soon reverting to our sort of research plan and going back to compare the BCS and the Millennium cohorts over the same sort of age points where we've got comparable data.
Yeah, because obviously there would be potentially a richness there of policy and practice implications. You know, is it just they always exist, or do they get worse over time, or do they suddenly get worse at particular time points? That would be the really interesting stuff to begin to answer. But I don't want to hog it up if other people have got questions, thoughts, or comments. Don't be shy.
Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah, don't be shy. That's exactly going to be my sentiment. And if you don't want to chat for domestic reasons, just put something in the chat, and I can read it out, and the question can be addressed. And if, oh yes, hello, good. Hello, Helen, thank you.
Hello, sorry, they've stopped cutting the tree for a moment. I was wondering, obviously you talked there about mothers, and I just wondered, and I appreciate that the data was probably too small, what you had about fathers who'd been in care and the impact on their kids.
So that's, I only have information for the fathers, because obviously in the older cohort, it was overwhelmingly the mother who responded to the surveys. So it's in the younger cohort where 100 and something, I know 100 and something fathers have been in care, but I haven't looked at that data yet, because we just focused on because we're still in the quite early stages of the project, but now we're going to be moving on to that, because I think that's going to be quite a unique set of data that we have, to have mothers and fathers. And well, I don't mean unfortunately, but I mean, unfortunately, in terms of quantitatively, I've only got 10 where it's both the mother and the father. So maybe I have to do a pen portrait or something, look for some more qualitative links, but it's not enough to do some robust analyses on. But that's going to be one of the key outcomes for us.
Cool, thank you.
Great, thanks.
Okay, we might move on to the next section, but I think the key message and the take-home message is you must have Sam back later in the project to present ongoing findings. Just get a monthly, biannual meeting.
Cheers.
But yeah, I think these might be something.
No, I'd be happy to.
That's fine. Great. Okay, so that was case study 1. So sort of remembering why we're doing this, aside from learning substantively and updates from Sam's work, it's to sort of think about how we can use secondary data in our own research. And so the second case study is one that I'm going to present from a few years ago, and it is actually, unlike Sam's, this is published, not that Sam's work in progress, mine is published, but that's not an indication on quality or anything. In fact, it might in fact be the opposite. I'm sort of whittling now, I've forgotten how to do this. Let me share my screen, and then I will talk you through case study 2, and again, thinking about how this might inform or give you some sense of what you might do with the data yourself to either build on the existing research or improve it. So this was research done in 2015 as part of another Nuffield funded project, but the PI was Jonathan Scarfield, who you'll know, with colleagues Xin-Yi Chung and Elaine Sharland. And actually, he's not mentioned here, but Meng Li, I've forgotten his surname, Jonathan, that's terrible. He continued the research after I had left. So there's some publications from Meng Li as well. So the research questions that this one addressed was to think about sort of what are the kind of characteristics that predict social service contact among young people in England. So these aren't causal, these are just associative differences. So essentially, who are the kids who received social service contact at a particular time point at a particular age in England, and what effect, it's italicized because obviously with secondary data, and we'll come on to this when we discuss some of the downsides to secondary data, is it is very difficult to establish causality. We can get close to causality, we can isolate the effects so that the coefficients are conservative, but we really can't say that that having social work contact in and of itself can cause something else to happen. So these are associations. But we're interested in, for those kids who did have social service contact, what were the young person's educational attainments, aspirations for higher education, locus of control, and mental health outcomes. So this is Next Steps. They were born in 1989-90. It began in 2004 when the cohort members were aged between 13 and 14. The unique thing about this is that it's linked to the census for National People Database in England. So we captured objective measures of their GCSE results, and we adjusted for school clusters because it was a school sampling structural style. The questions that we're particularly interested in, and the variables therefore, is in the last 12 months, have you been in touch with your local council social services because of the young person's behaviour at home or at school? This includes both you getting in touch with them and them contacting you. So it was a question to the parents. It was asked at wave 2 and wave 3. Actually, I think it was asked multiple times, but in order to sort of try and capture some temporal ordering, these were sort of pre-measures of social service contact, and the outcome measures were examined between wave 3 and wave 4. So in order to predict, we kind of combine those two measures. So we've got a kind of ever had social service contact between age 14 and 16. And then we're interested in, as I mentioned, educational attainment. So we look at GCSE results. These are the sort of benchmark for government achievement as a prerequisite to progress to further studies. So there's a sort of 5 A star to C GCSE, which allows students, is usually the threshold for students to continue on to A-level study. But we also have a linear score for GCSE attainment. We have questions in the Next Steps data about educational aspiration and sort of confidence. So it's whether or not students think they will apply to university, and if they do, whether they think they will get in. So these sorts of secondary effects are important for understanding educational inequality. So educational aspirations, if they differ in and of themselves and also net of their prior attainment, then it might say something about preferences or sort of behaviours of particular groups. The third outcome that I look at, or we look at rather, is locus of control, and there's sort of multiple dimensions to these measures. It's essentially the extent to which people believe that their events in their life result from their own actions or from factors external to them. So it's about sort of people feeling that they have a sense of control over their lives. And the last one is mental health, which is measured by the GHQ-12, which is a general health questionnaire. Despite the name, it captures specific sort of experiences of anxiety, depression, feeling worthless, a number of different dimensions that kind of are captured in this index of 12 items, and a threshold is sort of created. So usually it's, if there are 4 or more items from this list of 12, you're considered to have symptoms of poor mental health. It's not diagnosis, it's not that you're being treated, it's not clinically proven, but it's a screening tool to help sort of set it up. So it tells us a little bit about how these people are faring. So when we're sort of looking at the sort of what's so-called the treatment model. So in this paper, I was determined to learn some new methods. So having just finished my PhD at Oxford, I wanted to read more about new methods. And at the time, I was convinced that the IPWRA, the inverse probability weighted regression analysis, was the way to go. And basically what it does is it splits up the model into 2 sections. One is the treatment model, where it just looks at the predictors of the characteristics, and the second is the outcome model. So this will become clearer, I promise, just bear with me. We're interested in the sort of 4 domains of Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, where in the model to identify who had social service contact, we first looked at the structural factors, and in Next Steps, these were measured by social class, proxies for poverty, household tenure, free school meal eligibility. So we have these sort of structural components around them. So those are included in the model to try and understand who is more likely to receive social service contact. In terms of neighbourhood characteristic, we use variables such as neighbourhood type, geographic location, multiple deprivation index, and income deprivation. So a number of characteristics to try and isolate and understand the kind of contextual neighbourhood factors. Family characteristics, including marital status of parents, step-family status, relationship with parents, whether they're adopted, fostered, etc., family size, home language, relationship to parents and young person, as a whole wealth of characteristics to try and isolate and understand the sort of dimensions within the family that might influence social service contact or be associated with, I should say. And then the individual characteristics we measured through gender, ethnicity, externalizing behaviors like smoking, drinking, vandalism, contact with the police, SEN needs, and caring within the home. So I'll maybe come back to the outcome model in the hope that I can sort of focus your mind on this. So the research question was, what social factors predict social service contact among young people in England? And basically putting all of these factors into the model. So I'm just going to show you the multivariable results. The descriptive results tell a very similar story, but the multivariable results are a bit more conservative, because I think you could present the descriptive results, but people might say, well, that might be because it was driven by ethnicity, or that might be because it was driven by an unmeasured variable. So the more, to some extent, the more you include in the model, the more you're sort of isolating and making a more conservative estimate of the association or the association size between one variable and another. So my graphs are slightly different to Sam's. I'll just quickly talk you through them, but these are still odds ratios. So anything greater than 1 is a positive association. Anything less than 1 is a negative association. Where you see the asterisks, these denote statistical significance. If there's no asterisk, all it means is there is no, I'm trying to find no asterisk, but there isn't one. All it means is that the relationship, we can't be confident it isn't due to just chance alone. So statistical significance, we should be a bit careful about how we interpret. The relationship might exist, but we just can't be certain that it's not due to chance. So where you see an asterisk, we have more confidence in that finding is something that we should pay attention to. So the reference categories are generally in square brackets, although I can see I've forgotten one here, but I'll talk you through these results. What we find is that compared to the higher service social class, anybody with lower levels of social class have increased odds of having social service contact. So that means we see a social class gradient. Those from lower social class backgrounds are more likely to have social service contact than those from higher social class backgrounds. It's not completely linear, and I don't know if we would expect that anyway, but it's a general sort of trend. Step families compared to, I guess, biological families are having increased odds of having social service contact. So those more complex family structures are a sort of signal of who's having social service contact in adolescence. So too are people who have a foster parent versus a natural parent answering the question. So the odds there are massive, but I guess that's just a function of the system and the structure around them. Free school meal eligibility is a sort of measure for poverty or proxy for poverty, and those who are eligible for free school meals have an increased odds in having social service contact. In terms of the Bronfen-Brenner model neighbourhood characteristics, none of them were statistically significant over and above the other characteristics. So I'm not going to report them here, but they do remain in the model. So all of the other coefficients are sort of net of those. In terms of the sort of family relationships, we see that those who attended specially arranged meetings have higher odds of having social service contact. Again, that might just be a function of having social service contact. Frequency of arguing with their parents. If they argue most days compared to hardly ever, there's increased odds of having social service contact. And whether the young person reports whether they get on well with their parents or badly. If it's badly, it's almost 4 times the odds of having social service contact. There's things here about sort of how often you speak to teachers. Again, it's sort of the closer the contact with teachers, the more likely the young person is to have some social service contact. Again, that might be to complain or to sort of navigate the challenging situation. And what I think is quite interesting is if the parents socialise with the young person, they are less likely to report social service contact. So that seems to be a protective factor, but also I imagine it's also a kind of a factor of not having a complex relationship with your kids. So you're more likely to socialise, and therefore it's less likely to have social service contact. In terms of the individual characteristics, like Sam, well, Sam was looking at social care, but this is social service contact, not in care. But women were more likely compared to men to have social service contact in adolescence. I think that here the ethnicity categories, I think it was actually originally 7, but the differences between the white group and those other 6 were not statistically significant. So here it's just compared to mixed ethnicity, where those who are mixed are more likely to have social service contact than those who are white. Caring responsibility have increased odds, SEN needs have increased odds, and then things that sort of kind of surround what you might think of as some needs regarding social service contact, police contact, smoking, truancy were also statistically significant. So you're starting to build a picture of who gets social service contact from this data. So this was essentially from 2004-5 at age 13, between age 13 and 15 or up to 16, depending on when the birthdays were. So there's sort of boundary around that. So it's a very specific research question. In terms of the sort of association or the effect, again, when you sort of read your old work, you might change it all, but I definitely wouldn't call it an effect anymore, even though it was italicized. I would call it an association. So what is the association between social service contact and young person's educational outcomes? So we can sort of predict maybe no difference. Maybe social service contact might be acting for a proxy of something else. For example, it might just be a signal of local authority, resource, or money within a particular area, or availability, capacity, etc. It might have a corrective effect. So if a young person has social service contact, they might actually have higher aspiration, higher educational outcomes, higher levels of well-being, or it might have a reductive effect if we can sort of assume that it's causal. And again, I'm not sure that we can, but you might see sort of lower aspirations either through sort of labeling theory or some other sort of self-fulfilling prophecy dimension. So we can start to sort of think about what direction we would expect these results to go. And just talking you through the outcome model for the GCSE first. These are the first model looks at the linear score, and the second model is an odds ratio result. And both models basically show that those who had social service contact were less likely, had lower levels of GCSE results compared to those who didn't have social service contact. And the odds ratios are 0.94. So that I think it works out as 1 grade difference for the linear model, and it means that the people who have social service contact are statistically significantly less likely to achieve 5 A star to C in GCSEs. In terms of university aspiration, for those, when they were asked whether they were likely to apply to university, there was no difference between the social service contact group and those who didn't have social service contact. So there were no results that were sort of meaningful or different. In terms of the sort of subsample who were, when they answered yes, I'm likely to apply to university, if they were followed up and asked, do you think you'll be accepted if you apply, the odds are lower. So there's something there about confidence or belief or feeling of being accepted that is lower for those who've had social service contact. In terms of mental health outcomes, the GHQ measure that I described, we actually don't see any difference between the group who had social service contact versus the group who didn't have it. And in terms of locus of control, it's a sort of slightly mixed picture. There's no difference for the social service contact group versus those who didn't have contact on the dimension of whether they agreed with the statement, I will have a hard time getting a good job. So there's no difference there. When they were asked to agree or disagree with the statement, I have no chance in life, those who had social service contact had slightly higher odds of saying that that was the case. And it was also true that they sort of had externalizing locus of control. So success is a matter of luck, where that they're more likely to agree with that statement. So just conclusions, all else being equal, the following characteristics are associated with social service contact: lower social class background, coming from a step family, living with foster parents, free school meal eligibility, mixed race, female, etc. And when it comes to sort of reducing odds of social service contact, it was really just the characteristic of parents spending time with the young person. That included eating together regularly and going out together. In terms of the sort of outcome model, GCSEs, social service contact is associated with lower odds and the GCSE scores, and that's statistically significant. University aspiration and confidence, there's no difference for aspiration between the groups of who've had contact and those who haven't, but there is a difference on confidence. And I'm kind of calling it confidence in the sense that it's if they were planning on applying to university, whether they believe they'd be accepted if they applied. So you might interpret that slightly differently. No difference on mental health outcomes, and social service contact increases the odds of a young person reporting no internal locus of control, but that is a sort of more marginal and mixed finding. In terms of how we can explain these findings, I think it's still a bit of a puzzle. It could be that there's unobserved characteristics that distinguish the social service recipients from the rest, and that I've just not been able to take into account in the models, or that is observed in the data. It could be sort of ideas of labeling theory. So I mentioned that in the presentation, but it also might be learned helplessness. Those who receive more help become more helpless themselves. Poor quality social practice. I'm not deliberately trying to clickbait you, I promise, but these are some of the possibilities. Any beneficial effects might not be experienced in the short term. Maybe it's not a wide enough window to sort of observe any difference. And also, and I think this actually is definitely true, that these might not be the right outcomes to look at. It might not be as neat as GCSE results. Why would we expect it to impact GCSE aside from missing school or stress or other factors? It might be that the outcomes that we need to look at aren't either measured in the data or are things that are a bit more diffuse, like feelings of security or trust. And so we sort of challenge some of the dimensions of this research on that basis, I think. So I'm going to pause there. We've got one last little section to go, just about the pros and cons of this approach, but I will stop sharing for now, and I can see Jonathan's hand is up, so I'm happy to open up for questions to Jonathan first and then more generally. Hi.
Thanks, Morag. Great stuff. There is another paper, isn't there, in the British Journal of Social Work, which is about the predictors, and that one is about the effects. Just to remind people of two things that Morag did say, but just to remind you, it's not any social services contact, it's in relation to the young person's behaviour specifically. And obviously those models did take account of all those other predictors as well. So, those effects were over and above all that other stuff. And, there are lots of caveats, as on Morag's last slide, lots and lots of caveats about this study. However, when you put it together with the other papers that Morag did and also Menglay led on, actually every bit of analysis we did, which was looking at outcomes, taking into account all the risks that lead people to have social workers in the first place, and comparing them with the rest of the population, they all found rather pessimistic findings for the impact of social work. I mean, we didn't find any examples of social work improving people's situations when compared to other people of various ages who had similar adversities but didn't have social work. So you could say that when you put all that together, it does. There are some slightly troubling findings about social work. But yeah, each study on its own, obviously, you can critique and we can pull apart what we did.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also that point you sort of alluded to. It's hard. The counterfactual is hard to sort of get, because to necessitate some contact or some care intervention, it's likely that even though we've tried to control for the adverse characteristics so that we're sort of making all else equal as best we can, there's that unobserved thing that we just might not be capturing frequency, stress, resilience, response, all of these other things that we know humans respond to. I think one of the challenges, and I'll come on to that, is about this type of analysis is that it's slightly devoid of emotion. And I remember distinctly feeling nervous then when we were doing analysis, presenting this work to social workers at social work conferences and feeling like I'm going to get slaughtered. And so I really had to think carefully about what we were saying. And I actually think, I'm not sure what kind of job we did, having revisited it. I think it could probably be softer again. Like I say, the causality language is slightly dodgy to some extent, but I was young. But yeah, the point is, it's hard to know what the counterfactual is. So they both, like, imagine two people, they both need social service contact, but only one of them gets it. And that, you know, that one of them gets it is going to be contingent on so many other characteristics: the region they live in, the funding resource, the availability, the people referring them, the attention paid, like so many other things that are just not observed. And so we can sort of say, you know, these outcomes are not as good for this group compared to that group. But what we really want is a middle group who we do an RCT on, who need it but don't get it. So that we, like, what would it have been like if they didn't get this experience is maybe a better way of thinking about it. It could have been a lot worse. Their GCSE results could have been a lot worse. Their aspirations could, or their confidence could have been a lot worse. So maybe it's about framing it more in that way rather than this group versus that group. But yeah, it's where this data doesn't do well is the humanity, I think, and that's something I think is a limitation, undoubtedly. But yeah, anyway, comments, more comments, questions, observations. Bye, Donald.
Well, I've got a couple of things, but one's quite specific, but I just want to ask that first, which is I didn't really understand the thing about foster carers or foster parents. Was that if the child was with foster parents, they saw a social worker or something, or?
But it was, so if a child was living with a foster parent, they were more likely to be in contact with a social service worker for their behaviour.
Because of their behaviour, though, it wasn't just any routine contact, it was because of their behaviour specifically.
But presumably every single child in foster care, where there's a behaviour issue or not, actually has a social worker. You'd think it would be 100%.
But they don't all have behaviour problems, do they?
No. But of the ones with behaviour problems, you know, all of the ones in foster care will have a social worker, and some of the ones who aren't, surely? No?
But not all the children in the study have behaviour problems.
No, okay. I was just surprised it wasn't bigger. I mean, it was a big difference. I just thought it would be absolutely massive because
it is big. So those were odds ratios. So it was like 13 times. So kids who have a foster parent or are living with a foster parent are 13 times more likely to have social service contact than those who are not foster parents.
And just to check, there's a difference between those two things. So a child living in a foster placement is one thing. A child could be the biological child of foster carers and living in that house, but not a foster child.
So I'm going back a while, but I believe the question on that is from the household grid, and it's basically like, who are you living with? So I'm living with biological parents, parent and step parent, foster parent, adopted parents. Like there's a whole list of them. So it was just foster parent versus all others.
Yeah.
In fact, the comparison is foster parent versus biological parent in the model, but they're all in there. So it's it's a sort of I sort of appreciate your skepticism, but I think
it was just a little thing that in part time to ask a question as you were going through, so I didn't fully understand it. So that was a minor thing. I think the bigger thing is is exactly what you've said, whether this identifies. I have no problem with social work practice not making any difference. I literally spoke at a conference to practitioners this morning and said, in my opinion, 85% of allocated families, social workers make no difference to. So, you know, I'm perfectly willing to embrace that, but I suppose methodologically, it's difficult to know whether what you're seeing is that there's the systems are correctly identifying a difference between kids who are, you know, despite poverty and all these other things, there's actually maybe the abuse is the difference or something.
Yeah.
Or is it the lack of impact of the practice? I don't know.
I agree. I think that's where it's cloudy, and I think like even where the paper I think does stand up is that we sort of discuss some of the possibilities and the fact that they might be pulling in different directions. So what we see in terms of the results is actually a net effect of good things and bad things. So they are being supported, but they're also traumatized. You know, they're sort of it's a contracted version of that. And you know, I think my time at Cardiff taught me a lot about sort of quantitative analysis to a slightly traditionally non-quantitative field, and that is that you have to sort of defend to some extent and be accurate about what you're measuring, and also be upfront about where the limitations are. And I think there are many, and one of them is that we can't disentangle that push and pull. All we see is this number, we have to interpret it carefully. I just was always terrified of a Daily Mail headline, social work, down with the industry, like something terrifying. So it does force you to think in a bit more of a nuanced way. I'm very conscious of time, but is there any other quick questions on that particular paper? Because otherwise I'll do my last little bit, which is, and part of the reason to have these two case studies is to sort of demonstrate it in a real world way, and showing that there are many limitations, but just to sort of show you what I put together in terms of, can you see that? The sort of pros and cons. So this hopefully has been revealed throughout conversation and in your own thinking. This is specifically sort of pros and cons of secondary data analysis and quantitative analysis. They're not necessarily the same thing. And you could also probably add longitudinal analysis in there too, to make it even more specific. The upsides are that it's population level analysis, so it's representative. You can say something on a national level, or at least on a population level. It also has, as a result of that, it has a built-in control group. So if you're interested in caring responsibility, then you need to compare those people to non-carers. If you're interested in care leavers, you've got to compare them to non-care leavers. So most studies, I think part of the reason that psychology and some of the other fields that focus on just those who get therapy or those who get particular care is that you've already excluded a bunch of the sample and you're not comparing differences between groups. So population level analysis, not only is it representative, it reduces biases, but it allows you, it has a built-in control group to allow you to make some of those comparisons and subgroups within that further, like ethnicity or gender, for example. Because it's publicly available, at least to researchers, we do allow some private businesses to use it, but only if they can show it's not for commercial gain. It makes it replicable, it's robust, it's scientific, accessible. I think psychology as a field has gone through kind of a replication crisis because people collect their own data. That data is generally not available to other researchers to test it. So that's why you see a lot of studies in the psychological field being debunked, because it's just not, it's not easy to replicate it. And actually, if they tried to, then there's lots of reasons why you might not see the same result. The upside is you're making use of an available resource. It's more efficient, it's less costly in terms of sort of time, money, and it does allow you to use some complex methods if you're statistically inclined. And even if you're not statistically inclined, I think it can sort of reveal quite a lot, at least on a baseline level or a descriptive level, before you might go on to do some mixed method or qualitative research. The downsides, as I said, it's not human. Not everything can be observed. Despite how rich these data sets and resources are, we cannot observe everything. And so some of the assumptions behind what goes into the model and how things are modeled, it might be a shaky ground. I think one of the criticisms we got for this paper in one conference was it was a kitchen sink model. Everything just went in it, and to see what sort of shook out of it. So, it has to be sort of theoretically and sensibly approached, because there's just so many variables that you can't just reasonably put everything in. Because it's longitudinal, attrition is an issue, particularly for the most vulnerable populations. So people who experience homelessness by nature are harder to find. People from lower social class backgrounds or lower levels of education famously drop out of the studies over time. We use weights and that tries to correct that so that it remains representative. But if you're interested in particular groups, I think you have to be a bit careful about attrition and missing data. Missing data can be sort of either at a particular time point or refusing to answer a particular question. So in some of the studies, we do ask about child abuse and experiences within their childhood. And some people may just refuse to answer that question, but have answered everything else. So we might see that there's no response to some of the most sensitive questions. We'd love to, but we can't go back in time and change the question wording, and we can't go back in time and add questions. We can ask things retrospectively if it's reasonable, and we're open to hearing some of those suggestions, but you can't tailor the data to your exact needs. There are limitations. It wasn't measured at that age. It was slightly different wording. There are some reasonable things you can do to harmonize the data, but again, it has to sort of be made in quite a transparent way. And yeah, I've added complex methods to the downsides too, because I know that for lots of people, yeah, it's a bit of a thing to overcome in terms of the number involved. And that's the end really. But I don't know how we're doing. We've got a few minutes, and I think we're happy. I'm certainly happy to stay back if you want to ask any particular questions, either about the variables, the data sets, the methods, the studies that we've presented, anything. Or nothing is also fine.
I think Helen's put a question into the chat.
Yeah, hi Helen, thanks.
I don't know how well you can hear me above the chainsaws.
That's fine.
I have asked a question in the chat, and it's really about case study 2. So it touches on those kind of pros and cons you've just touched on. So I'm going to be doing some work which will look at structural and neighbourhood kind of factors. So it's kind of, I'm just really curious about what would you have liked to have put in had the data been available? And are there any, so were there any inherent weaknesses with the ones that you had to use?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm going to have to jog my memory of the Bronfenbrenner sort of approach. So I think it was sort of things on the outer circles, isn't it? Sort of the concentric circles of the Bronfenbrenner model. So it's sort of more societal factors. And I think in truth, I struggled with this because if it's truly societal, then it would affect everyone in the study in the same way. But I think where we did our best to sort of isolate the sort of structural things, we used proxies for poverty. So like free school meal eligibility is a reasonable proxy for poverty. So they're eligible if they have a household income of less than £17,000 or are on a particular combination at the time of a set of benefits. And so I think that kind of poverty aspect is going to capture access to resource, access to support, possibly other characteristics that are related to social class too. We included household tenure. So this was things like whether you owned your house outright, mortgage, rent through a local authority or rent through a private landlord. And I think even that, would say something about sort of levels of security, permanence, and the other one that we included was that was neighbourhood, the multiple deprivation index. That was for the neighbourhood characteristics. But yeah, to answer your question about sort of what would I have liked, it's a difficult one. I'm not sure. Jonathan, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that particular point, but
I just took a comment in the chat, Maura, to say that my recollection is it wasn't the structural and neighbourhood things that were missing. It was the family. It was the more serious adversities in the family were the main things we didn't have and we would have liked to have had. So, you'd really like to have stuff about child abuse, wouldn't you? But it's incredibly difficult to ask about, and we didn't have that stuff.
Well, I should sort of say at age 32, we are going to ask them a retrospective childhood experiences question. So during your childhood, did you experience death of a parent? So we could be able to get that, for example, through the household grid, but that and I don't think sexual abuse explicitly, but certainly abuse within the family. And there's sort of several childhood adversity type questions that we're asking retrospectively. Obviously, with any retrospective measure, there are challenges with recall and willingness to share. But I think when there are such impactful ones, people are probably going to remember. It's whether they were willing to sort of share those is a slightly different issue. But we're hoping to fill in some of the gaps from childhood, because next steps is an adolescence survey. We don't have a lot of the early years stuff. But yeah, like geographic indicators, or like who the local council was in a particular area. That's still neighbourhood structural. Just stay in touch if there are things that you want to chat to us about.
I just wanted to say thank you. It's really interesting, and I wouldn't worry about quantity in terms of it's quality. I would say everyone on here is or is potentially a PI of studies. So hearing about this is really, really helpful and thought-provoking. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, well, like I say, stay in touch if there's things about either the studies or the cohorts or the variables or the consultations and things going forward. But CLS really want to maintain this strong relationship with researchers. So yeah.
Thank you ever so much, both. I mean, it's really grateful that you've given up your time to come and do it. And as Donald said, I think people have taken a lot away from your presenting. So it's been really useful. Thank you.
No problem. It's nice to see you all, and thanks for your contributions.